The world is facing more challenges than ever before. Climate change, migration, inequality, food security, the list goes on. And these are big, complex challenges, so big that they can't possibly have a single owner. They're global and systemic. They need careful thought as their interconnectivity is not to be underestimated. What seems to be an obvious solution to one challenge might cause more damage to another. And so, what is the answer? In recent podcasts, we've talked about the polycrisis, VUCA, BANI, and sustainability. And we realised that a common thread to these conversations was systems leadership. But what do we mean by that, and how can it be applied? So today's guest on In Good Company is Dr. Kate Simpson, Director of the Systemcraft Institute at Wasafiri. She joins me today to talk about how leaders and organisations can address these complex problems and ultimately contribute to a more peaceful, equitable, and sustainable world. Kate, thank you ever so much for joining me today. Welcome to In Good Company. How are you?
I'm great. Yeah, thanks for having us.
Well, it's a delight to have you here, and thank you. I always like to thank our guests for giving some of your valuable time to us. We just to give our audience a bit of a chance to get to know you a bit better, we ask our guests the same question every time, which is to tell us about yourself in 60 seconds.
Thanks, Dan. I was thinking a bit like a goldfish, so whatever's been going on most recently is where I tend to start, what I remember. So today I'm the director of the Systemcraft Institute. So I've actually been spending the morning thinking about collaboration and how we do collaboration. And I'm also working on a couple of projects on leadership development, actually. And also today I was the person making sandwiches for my kids and chasing one of them down the road with a forgotten PE kit. So that's who I am today. And sort of wider things are, I'm a director at Wasafiri, and we're an organisation set up to pioneer new approaches to tackling our most complex problems. And so we work on a lot of things like radicalisation, what makes some people more vulnerable to radicalisation than others, food system security, climate change and food, and also at the moment working on a project around the just energy transition as well, and what sort of leadership you needed for that. So that's sort of what we do. I'm based in the UK, here in the Lake District, down the road from you, but our main office is in Kenya, in Nairobi in Kenya, and most of my colleagues are Kenyan, so I get to kind of learn a lot from them along the way. And before today, I've done lots of other things. I've been an academic, I've been an outdoor educator, kind of focused on issues of social justice. I was managing director of Wasafiri for a few years as well. So I've done a range of different things that kind of bring me here to today.
Yeah, awesome. And I'd like to delve into some of what you've just mentioned there a bit deeper here. So as in the intro, we talked about systems leadership. So maybe it would be good if you can kind of outline what systems leadership is and what it means, and why is it relevant for the complex world that leaders are navigating today?
Okay, well, I've been in the leadership space for quite a long time, one way and another, and we do love to add these words to leadership, whether it's servant leadership or emotional leadership or neuro leadership. I remember at one point. I think it is worth just saying, what on earth does this mean? And I actually think it means two quite different things, and it gets talked about kind of interchangeably. So on one side, there's leadership for systems change. And on the other, there's a systems-informed way of doing leadership. And they're quite different. So leadership for system change is where you say, okay, there's some sort of systems gap, some sort of inequity, something that's means that the current way of doing things in a space is delivering great outcomes for some and really poor for another. And so the examples, we do a lot of work, as I said, around food. So it could be something like food waste. Why is there so much food waste? And in Kenya we have there's as much food waste, but it's at production rather than consumption. So you take a problem like food waste, or you take a problem like why is there low capital investment into green engineering tech solutions here in the UK? There's money for startups, no money for scale ups, and that's really slowing down our evolution in things like particularly water and energy industries. So systems leadership for systems change is where you take a problem like that and you put that at the heart and you say, okay, who are the actors who influence this? Who do we need to bring together? And you start with the problem. And then you
Right.
bring together, be a cross-sector, cross-organizational set of people. And that's leadership for system change. And the purpose is to change an element of the system. And then the
Right.
stuff that gets talked about a little bit more on the sort of learning development side is a sort of systems informed way of doing leadership. And that's different. And it intends to focus on saying, well, how do we, it's a way of thinking about organizations less as machines and more as natural systems, or it's a way of saying systems leadership tends to be more about focusing on the relationships that connect people, or the rules of the game. So it could be interpersonal relationships, but it could be things like processes and procedures and policies and regulations and vision and goals and purpose, and these things that connect people. And in that sense, I think systems leadership, we can see it as people have been banging on for a long time saying heroic leadership doesn't really work, and command and control stuff doesn't really work when you're dealing with complex problems.
Mm-hmm.
And systems leadership is that antidote. It's a way of doing leadership that looks at things in a less looks at change in a less hierarchical way. But you could do that sort of leadership to the same old ends in your organization. It's not actually necessarily about changing a system. So hopefully that's helpful. But
yeah.
two different things.
Can it be applied to stuff that's not? Can it be applied to a wider problem? As in, it doesn't have to be something that's, like you said. I mean, a lot of it's kind of food and that type of thing that you were talking about before. Like, can it just be a kind of a small complex problem within an organization, or can it be applied else in other contexts?
Yeah. So I think when people use it as a way of doing leadership, the classic things, the classic sort of complex problems you see inside organizations, I think anything in the bucket of culture, culture is a complex problem. It's a second order thing. And no one person owns culture in your organization.
Yeah.
And like all one of the characteristics of complex problems is they resist change, and you can't work on them directly. You work on the conditions that create them. Mm-hmm. So if you find yourself in an organization going, oh, we want culture change, or you find yourself saying things like, we want a more innovative way of doing things, or more innovative culture, or we want to be more agile, or we want to be more risk-taking. If you find yourself saying these sort of things, then you're probably in the territory of a complex problem, and a systems approach to leadership is going to could well help unlock that.
Yeah.
I would say you could become more innovative and still to the same organizational outcomes. It might not produce a benefit to people outside your organization.
Right.
It could.
And we also mentioned in the intro other episodes that we've and topics on episodes that we've recorded in the past around frameworks. So in particular, I'm thinking of VUCA and BANI, which is a newer sort of the newer VUCA, if you don't already know. And so, what do you think those frameworks are useful for this type of approach?
I think they can be. Like when we're talking about these things, we're often talking about abstract things like complexity, ambiguity. These are abstract things, and it helps us to have frames of reference, particularly so that we can talk to each other about them and sort of be talking about the same thing. So in that sense, I think they are useful. I'm not sure that we need to, and personally, I can't quite get my head around how kind of at a operational level or at a sort of practical level, those two are particularly different. I'm not sure what they offer us differently, but I think they can be useful because they help groups of people to talk about abstract things. The challenge with both of those sort of frameworks is that they're diagnostic. They help us to understand the nature, that why we're finding something difficult. They don't necessarily help us to understand. So what do I do about it? How do I work with it differently? So they're useful.
Yeah, I see. And we're going to be speaking to the creator of the BANI framework on the podcast. That'll be really interesting. No, well, I think it's. I think what you've said is complete. Yeah, well, I think what you said is completely right, because they are a framework in order to kind of help. They're a framework in how to kind of recognize what's going on, but it doesn't necessarily provide you with the answers to how to deal with those things. So I think that's absolutely right.
And it is useful. I mean, if we can't recognize what's going on, then we definitely can't show up and lead and do different things. So I would say that they are they are useful in
Yeah,
that.
yeah, I suppose that's it, isn't it? And it's just, but then it doesn't mean to say that there's not something else that will work equally as well. It's just a way. It depends on, I suppose, your learning style, that of how you apply these different things to the problems that you're trying to solve, I suppose.
Yeah, and probably as someone who's sort of seeped in the systems stuff, I would say their biggest utility is that they help people to connect with
Mm,
each other. So it's not just
hmm.
like, how do I understand it? It's if we're working together, is this a shared language that we can use to help ourselves go, oh, we're dealing with loads of ambiguity at the moment.
Hmm.
And when we're dealing with loads of ambiguity, there's no point in endlessly in thinking we'll get to a time when we've got all the data or we understand it. Like, that's what we're navigating ambiguity. So I think the value of these things is how they help people connect with each other, not just as a sort of intellectual
Yeah,
exercise for an individual.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, on that then, let's talk about some of what people can do to sort of help drive change in their organization. So, what's from your point of view, or from what steps would you advise a leader who is trying to kind of drive that change in their organization? What could they do from a systems approach to help that would help accelerate their success?
Okay.
It's just a small question.
so so I think the the first thing about complex problems is that they present in non-intuitive ways. So what you
Mhm,
see often tells you very little about what's going on underneath the surface.
mhm.
And we are so wired, particularly in the sort of Western kind of way of doing things, to jump very quickly to solutions. And we have like language, don't we? Like, don't
Yeah.
bring me problems, bring them solutions, quick wins, low hanging fruit. We love this stuff. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah,
our brains love it. Our brains love to put things in boxes and quickly make sense of them. So one of the things about complex problems is they present in non-intuitive ways. So if you react to what you see on the surface, at best you have little impact, and at worst you make things worse.
mhm,
So the first thing with if you're going to take a systems-based approach, is you're going to say, oh, I've got this complex, it's a complex problem, I have to look below the surface, I have to get kind of really curious about why this problem is here. And complex problems in our organizations generally have hung about for a long time.
mm,
They've generally resisted other things that we've tried to do to change them. So that's one of the clues when you're on the terrain of the complex. And not jumping to quick solutions, I think, is one of the first things that systems people do. And
yeah,
part of the reason for that is that complex problems are always produced by systems that are working. And when we say the system is broken, we become blind to the power in it. And the resistance always sits in what is working and not in what isn't working.
mhm,
So if I give you kind of an in-organization example, um, silos. People love to go on about silos, don't they? We've got to break
yeah,
silos. Silos are a terrible thing. Every organization's been trying to break silos.
yeah,
But silos actually work really well in organizations. They
mhm,
create accountability, they create belonging, they create clarity often about who's doing what. And so the reason that silos keep popping up again and again and again in organizations is because of those reasons.
mhm,
Yeah, we also know it's also true that they inhibit collaboration, they can make people territorial, they can kind of create infighting in organizations or capturing of resources. All of those things are true, but that's not where the resistance to change sits.
mhm,
The resistance to change sits in the things that are great about silos. So if you're trying to bring more of a systems approach and you find yourself saying, oh, I need a more collaborative culture and we've got lots of silos, the first thing is actually to go, well, what's working about this? Who's it
yeah,
serving? What's it delivering for? Because that's that understanding. And that also will help you to understand where the resistance to change is going to come from. And it's
mhm,
actually those things you have to fix or have to kind of offer alternatives to or speak into if you want to create change. Um, so that's kind of one thing I think a systems approach does. The second is a systems approach kind of pulls you not to look at the kind of surface level things, the what systems people are called the elements, the people or the things. It pushes you to look to what are the rules of the game, what are things that are driving the connections here, And that
Hmm.
can be relationships. So how do we build different sorts of relationships? How do we um, work together differently? How do we do dialogue together differently? But it's also things like, what are the policies and processes and that stuff in our organization? So if you say you don't want silos, but you reward people for very narrow sets of achievement, kind of that sit within that they need to control, then you're probably always going to get silos. So how do you make collaboration a way of people actually being successful at their jobs, or how do you link those things together? There's lots been talked about the physical sort of spaces that engender collaboration. So
Yeah.
systems lens tends you to pull you to think about and work on different stuff within your organization.
I really like, yeah. As soon as you mentioned silos, I, amongst probably many other people that might be listening to this, will smile also out of recognition for,
Yeah.
I don't think there's ever been a place that I've worked where silos haven't existed in one way or another.
And so
And
if we ask ourselves what's really good about them,
yeah,
it suddenly opens up to be able to speak to that. Whereas if we're just constantly talking about what's bad about them, we just are totally blind.
and
And the
yeah, and
power
so
is always
I
in.
think, yeah, and that can be applied to so many problems. It's like, well, first of all, let's reframe it, not necessarily see it as a problem, and see, right, what's the benefit of whatever that might be, and then it's a really
It's
interesting way of thinking.
it's both. If a thing is only a problem, it just evolves out of existence. It stops happening. We know that.
Yeah.
We know that from nature as well. Yeah, things that are not working for anyone just simply dissipate. They just don't. And probably you can think about that the reverse way. And probably most people can think about innovations or interventions that have been tried in their organizations that have just drifted off and never got
Mm,
traction.
mm.
Products that have been brought to market that haven't actually solved a problem people had. You know, those things as well, just that when they're not working for anybody, they don't stick around.
It's true.
um
It's true. So
but
I guess,
so
oh, go on,
well, I had another sort of way that we can think about systems
please. Yeah.
leadership within an organization, but I don't know if that's
Yeah, please do.
all right. So I think the other thing, which is that when if you're bringing a systems approach, say you have a problem, systems approach would always put the problem at the heart, or the thing you want to change, or the opportunity you want to grasp, and then say, right, what's the system of people and processes and things around this that we should bring together to try and work on this, rather than a more traditional approach in an organization is to say who controls resources, and then we'll try and get as high up the level of control of resources and work there. So to give you an example, maybe we were doing some really interesting work with a partner organization, Co-Create, actually, with
Hmm.
the NHS. And the NHS is this very multi-headed organization. And they were taking something like, trying to get people discharged from hospital so that they're not kind of people that are ready to be out but can't be
Yeah.
at home. They call it bed blocking here, but so you take a problem like that and you say, well, actually, if we're going to solve that, if we're going to understand it and then solve it, who are the people that influence that? And that then you end up with paramedics and social care and hospital administrators and patients and their families
Hmm.
and OTs and social housing providers. You end up with a very, very different constituent if you put the problem at the heart and then gather people around it. Whereas if you just say, well, in our kind of bit of the NHS, in our hospital, who controls resources, you end up with a much narrower set of people. And you can apply the same to, if you're wrestling with a supply chain issue and you say, well, actually, who influences this supply chain issue, you'll end up with people that aren't even inside your organization.
Mm.
So that's the other, I think, way of thinking of bringing a systems-based approach, is to say, well, what's the thing we're working on and who influences that, not just who has kind of power within our organization.
It's almost like zooming out on your thinking, isn't it? That kind of really thinking about every every aspect of who might be connected to something. And sometimes it's not, we're so focused on the day to day that we don't often step back and go, just right, oh, hold on, like, let's just think a bit wider, zoom out, and like think a bit about bigger picture than what's just going on for you in the moment, right? Does that sound like that's correct? Or
Yeah, the weird thing is, I think as people, we're really good at doing it. Like we do it very naturally outside of work. So if you think about if you're going to say, I want to be part of a happy family, whatever that means. You wouldn't
mm,
imagine some one person in the family could solve that. You'd say,
mm,
oh, right, well, this depends on where we live and how far people travel to school, or what we're eating, or who we get to visit, or what social activities. You just look at it in a much wider way.
yeah,
The same if you think about, the street you live on, like, and what makes it a nice street to live on. So humans, we're really good at that systems way of thinking in the spaces that we live our lives. But something about organizations, particularly kind of, it's the sort of scientific management, optimized for efficiency. There's a particular
mm,
way of running
mm,
organizations, which is actually really different to how we tend to operate outside of organizations.
yeah,
So I think there's something, the thing behind your head says liberating human potential, doesn't it? I just think systems ways of working are actually very human, and
mm,
people get them really easily, really
yeah,
intuitively. We're actually calling on stuff that we do in lots of other spaces of our lives.
yeah. Just that application, that reapplication to our work. Yeah.
Yeah, there's lots of structures in organizations that sort of push that out sometimes. So,
Well,
uh,
we've kind of touched on my next question already, which is like what is the connection between systems leadership and learning? You've kind of touched upon that on as part of your other answers, and I'm wondering if you wanted to kind of extract any of what you've just said and kind of culminate it into one answer for that.
yeah, I think the two big things are that any system is very contextual, whether it's an organizational system or a healthcare system or a food system.
Yeah.
That no two are the same. So you have to be really good at learning what's going on around here.
Hmm.
You can look at others, similar organizations, see what they've done, but the ability to go, what's going on around here, and learn about that is massively important. And secondly, particularly with any of these complex problems, like you said in the intro, we're solving the sorts of problems or we're tackling the sorts of issues we've never tackled before.
Mm,
How do we decarbonize our economies?
mm,
And so the only way we can figure that out is by trying things out, learning as we go. There isn't a sort of manual, and we're not going to be able to just sit and technically work out the answer and then implement it. So
hmm.
learning is a very big part of systems work. Now, the ability to actually change what we do as we learn is, I think, kind of separate almost, or it's the second part. um,
So out of that, then, what would you say are some key skills that either people need or need to learn in order to have a systems leadership approach?
um, so sort of, yeah, just thinking it through its skills lens, I think there's a massive capacity for curiosity,
Hmm.
and there's a really strong sense of like, I don't know it all. So who knows things different, who has
Yeah.
different perspectives. So there's a massive capacity for that. There's an ability to kind of hold this polarity of complexity and agency.
Hmm.
So when things are very complex, we can all get pulled to one of these two kind of poles, where either it's so complex it feels really overwhelming, and we're like,
Hmm.
oh my gosh, there's so much going on here. I don't know where to start. I don't know how to start. It feels a bit hopeless, and you sort of get paralyzed by that. Or you get pulled to the polarity of trying to just simplify everything and say,
Yeah.
right, I'm going to find the magic bullet. There's one thing. There's too much noise, and yeah, drill it right down. Which again makes us feel very activist, but usually just massively underplays what's going on. And yeah, it's sort of stuff that tends to keep people busy but doesn't have a lot of impact. So you can get pulled to those polarities. And I think people who can work in this systemsy way can sort of hold both, can go, there's
Hmm.
loads going on here, and I can find agency and ways to step forward in it. So I think that's a really key skill. They can, they don't collapse down one end or the other of that. I think there's a sort of, one of the things I think is quite difficult sometimes about systems leadership is it is the opposite of the heroic leadership, and it's a lot about working with and through and alongside other people, and you have to be quite okay about not getting the credit for that.
Hmm.
it doesn't do well for people who want to be kind of the heroic leader in there, and that can be hard sometimes in our organizations that kind of reward individual kind of prominence. And I think, well, maybe that goes with, the ability to sort of put the problem, not the institution, at the center of what you're doing.
Hmm.
What's the issue we're working on together, not what's my organization. If you're working on something that's going to ask you to step outside the bounds of your organization, if you're only driving for your organization's agenda, that will get very difficult.
Yeah. And so can you tell me a bit more about Systemcraft and your approach at Wasafiri?
Yeah. So Systemcraft, we reverse engineered that from our work. So we spent about
Right.
8 or 9 years doing we didn't have the language at the time, but working on a variety of really complex problems like food security, radicalization, what makes some people more vulnerable to radicalization. And we asked ourselves, I think it was about 2018, 2019 now, we asked ourselves, so what have we learned about how you make change happen in these really
Mm.
complex environments? And we looked at our work and other people's work and other people's thinking. And out of that reverse engineered Systemcraft. And what
Right.
we noticed was that, there was lots of people, like people get systems thinking and lots of stuff about that. But kind of practical people were saying, in organizations with busy jobs, we're saying, okay, I get that, but what do I do next?
Mm.
And we're trying to answer that question. It's an imperfect answer, but we're trying to help people go, okay, so what do I do next when I'm faced with a complex problem? And so, Systemcraft helps people, one, look at the problem
Hmm.
massively through the lens of going, well, this thing is working. So what's working around here? Trying to understand it. And then saying, well, you can't work directly on that problem, usually with a complex problem. We work on the conditions that create it. And there's 5 things that we find that you can work on. I
Yeah.
often say it's the difference between if you're looking at your whole garden and trying to make your garden healthy versus just looking at one plant.
Yeah.
And so we've got a set of things that we found that you can work on to help for complex problems and create system level change.
Yeah. It's in terms of clients that you've worked with, is it getting the response that you kind of expected? Like, is it landing well?
I'd say yes.
Yeah, yeah, of course, yeah.
Partial.
But like, are you like? I
Um,
mean, I guess you obviously can't talk about specific examples, I guess, but it's just key. I always like a story,
yeah.
and I suppose it's like the hearing where it's like, what maybe can you give without naming
Yeah.
names, but can you give it a
I
specific
can.
example of where it's worked out?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I can definitely give. I can give specific examples as well.
Oh,
That's fine.
well, even better.
Um, so there's a big piece of work that we've been involved in called Generation Africa, and
Hmm.
so you know it, across the continent, roughly 60 to 80% of people are involved in food and food production. So
Mm.
if you want to tackle food insecurity, if you want to tackle climate change, if you want to tackle poverty, kind of food and agriculture is the sort of go-to sector in a way that is a bit different here in the UK.
Hmm.
But there's a real kind of systemic problem in that young tech savvy people don't really want to go into agriculture. It's seen as the work of your granny. Generally it's seen
Right.
as sort of a work mostly of older women, so it's not seen as an aspirational place. It's not seen as a future focused sort of kind of livelihood.
Mm.
um, but it's so important for the future of the continent that
Yeah.
young tech savvy entrepreneurial people, Kenyans, Rwandans, are called to want to go into that sector. So that's your systemic problem. And at the same time, a bunch of agribusinesses are seeing that their supply chains are going to collapse because people are literally leaving the land.
Mm.
And so they're saying, well, we're not going to have a supply chain in 10 years' time. So you've got this sort of shared systemic problem there. And so we were the sort of architects of bringing together a set of big agribusinesses. Yara was the lead on that. They're a big Norwegian fertilizer business,
Right.
alongside a Econet, who are sometimes called the Netflix of Africa. They might say
Right.
they might say Netflix is the Econet of America.
Sure.
So they're run by a Zimbabwean entrepreneur. Strive Masiwa. So he brought together these very different sectors who were saying, well, we know a lot about young people and how to get them galvanized and what they care about. And we know a lot about the food sector. And there were some other players in there, some NGOs and some national governments. And they said, well, together, how do we work together to tackle that problem? So, the Systemcraft stuff was saying, well, we need to organize for collaboration. No organization can solve this alone. So how do we organize properly for these different entities with very different worldviews to collaborate?
Yeah.
There was a big piece about making change matter. So when we want change to happen, we have to make it matter to the people that need to do the changing. Not a bunch of people who say, you lot should change, but how do you make change matter to the people that need to do the changing? And that's where Econet were really powerful, because they were like, well, we understand what young people are driven by. And we ended up organizing a big continent-wide prize, actually, to say, well, there's actually already these people out there. We need to find them, elevate their stories, put some more money into helping them grow their businesses. So we've had over 3 years some great stories. There's companies making, alternative proteins and making ice creams out of black soldier fly, and people using different sorts of information technology to help farmers to choose what to grow. People turning waste products into food products.
Wow.
So there's been all sorts of incredible innovation that was already happening. So finding that, elevating those stories, telling those stories, and also doing some sort of capital flows, and then saying, what are the incentives? Where are these businesses getting stuck? So that was some of the incentives piece. So that's another big piece of Systemcraft. How do you shift incentives? And there's another piece about harnessing collective intelligence. This stuff's already happening. People are already innovating all over the place. But how do you help people from Botswana to share with people from Zimbabwe to, learn what's working around things in Nigeria? So helping that, and helping kind of the businesses and the investors as well find these opportunities. So there was a big part about, you talk about asymmetries of information, connecting that system together better. So we can put the links to Generation Africa, if you like, in the
well, I'm fascinated by. Can I just pick you up
that was
on
really using Systemcraft to architect.
Yeah, right. I'm fascinated by that innovation stuff that you were talking about, and I'd love to ask you loads more questions about that, but I'm conscious of time. But one thing I did want to ask you about. What did you say? Black soldier fly ice cream?
Yeah. So alternative proteins. So there's lots going on the continent about alternative protein sources, both for people and also as, we're doing some work in Kenya, but one of the, getting to learn from an organization there is using it for fish foods as well. So alternative protein sources. And then you also get a livelihoods dividend as well. So people in that case in Kenya, they've got a livelihoods project going where women are farming the black soldier fly on using waste material from the market, so like discarded fruits and veg, and they're using that to farm and then selling that into fish food, into local fish farms who previously were importing from China. So you've got a climate dividend, you've got a livelihoods dividend, you've got circularity. So that sort of innovation and supporting people to do that and to tell those stories and to unlock capital flows and all those things. But that's also people willing to work outside the boundaries of their own organizations.
Oh, that's awesome. And just hearing some of the innovation that's come from it is, in theory, that sort of stuff could solve huge amounts of world problems, like you're saying, turning food waste back into essentially food. It's just amazing to hear. So I'd love to learn more about that.
And this sort of innovation is going on at pace. We get to particularly work in East Africa, and so I sort of see more of these examples from Kenya, but across the continent.
Well, speaking of pace, as you've said, things are moving at pace, and I suppose one thing that's moving particularly at pace, of course, is technology. And I suppose AI is the kind of one of the big hot topics at the moment. A recent podcast guest described this as the start of a new era as AI becomes more prevalent in everyday life. So is this something that you're seeing as a common thread across the stakeholders you deal with, or what effect, if any, do you see are the biggest themes of that changing role in technology?
I mean, technology interesting. I've just been listening to Mustafa Suleiman's book on the coming wave, which is definitely a big part of that story and those technologies. Yeah, I mean, the role of technology certainly across we see it across our work quite a lot, and it's an enabling factor. So it sometimes it enables certain change to happen. So probably I was thinking about this before this, but I think probably the biggest technological change in Kenya has been M-Pesa, mobile money, which has come in the last probably now 10 years, and that's really unlocked. It's caused all sorts of social change, changed some gender norms about who can hold money. It's provided effective banking services to the unbanked. It's changed the way they do tax in the country. And that's a technology that's unlocked a whole set of other, ways of transferring capital and so on. So I don't think we should just focus on AI. It's not the only technology out there. It's just the sort of one that's kind of, it is definitely hugely disruptive. I think always the question is with any of these technologies is what ends have they been harnessed to, and they can they can just be massive accelerants and amplifiers of existing inequality, and digital divide is very real here in the UK as well. So as a sort of someone thinking about system change and thinking about how do we tackle some of our shared collective challenges, I think some of the question is how do we harness those technologies to more equitable ends. That would be, and usually, the blocker to change is, tech is an enabler, but it doesn't make, more equitable forms of change happen on its own.
No, it's true.
That all sits with, disrupting whether sort of more human ways of relating.
Yeah. Well, listen, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation with today, Kate, and I'd love to ask you loads more questions, but we simply haven't got time. What we do have time for, however, is our last question, which is the question we ask everybody at the end of our podcast episodes, which is if you were to start your career again, what would be the best piece of advice you'd give yourself?
Do you know what? I'm not sure I would give myself any advice. I think I'd just say, thank you for what you're about to go through, because it all layers up. And I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure I'd actually give myself any advice.
Well, you're not, in actual fact, you're not the first person to say that really, or something along those lines. We've had people say, reflect on the current, on the now, and go, well, actually, things are all right. Things are pretty good, and you got to here because of the way that you lived your life. So it's a really kind of nice way of thinking about it. That actually, I wouldn't. So it's a really nice answer. I thank you again ever so much. We have run out of time, sadly, but it's been a joy talking to you today, and I feel like I've learned lots, but I feel like I've got loads more to learn as well. I'm fascinated certainly by black soldier fly ice cream and turning food waste into food. So I'm going to be looking into more of that for sure. So thank you, Kate, for joining us.
Oh, it's a real pleasure, Dan. Thanks for having us.
No, thank you. So that just leaves me to say that if you'd like to find out more about systems leadership, then we'll make sure that we've got all of those links that are going to be relevant in the description of today's episode. Thank you to watching or listening, depending on where you found this podcast. And don't forget to look at our back catalogue if you haven't already. That just remains for me to thank Kate again once more for joining us today. And until the next time, take care.